Well, I think we have a nice group of people so far, so we'll move forward and we'll get started. I want to welcome everyone to today's Creatives on Esherick talk with Laura Mays. I'd ask you to mute if you haven't already. I'm Emily Zilber. I'm the Director of Curatorial Affairs and Strategic Partnerships at the Wharton Esherick Museum. We're so excited for you to join us today for this conversation, which we will get to after just a little housekeeping. We want to let everyone here know that we hope to see local friends in person for the reopening of the museum in September. Full details, including the COVID-19 protocol, can be found on our website, and we'll link to them in the chat. We hope to see you at our next virtual event as well. This is our 2020 annual party, from Esherick's Kitchen to Yours, which will happen on Sunday, September 13th. And we've got some great guests there, including the furniture maker Nancy Hillier and her new book, Kitchen Think, Dan Macy and Paul Savage, who are the owners of the Margaret Esherick House, to talk about Esherick's Kitchen in that incredible Lucan designed building. And then for folks who know Philadelphia and maybe even beyond, the chef Joe Badia, who is a master pizza maker and has actually done one of our Creatives on Esherick's posts because he is an Esherick collector. So hopefully we'll see you. We're glad to see you today. Hopefully we'll see you back for some other things. Today's talk with Laura Mays came about as a result of Creatives on Esherick, which is our social media series and virtual programming that highlights contemporary artists, makers, and scholars inspired by Esherick's work. Laura was the first in the series, and her piece brought up all sorts of new ideas and questions that we're really excited to talk about today. But if you haven't had a chance to read what she wrote, there's a link to that on the website. So I'm going to give her an introduction, and then we'll have about 25 or 30 minutes for conversation. We'll leave about 10 minutes for questions at the end. So Laura Mays is a woodworker, designer, educator, and writer. Her work seamlessly marries immaculate craftsmanship with an architectural sensibility, understanding of history and context, a smart approach to functionality, and a true depth of conceptual thinking. This is true regardless of what she makes, and I encourage you to spend time on her website, which has a fantastic array of her pieces and her writing about them. Laura is the director of the Fine Woodworking program at the Krenov School, Mendocino College in Fort Bragg, California. Her work is represented in the National Museum of Ireland and in private and public collections in the US and Ireland. She's also the founding president of the Krenov Foundation, a nonprofit organization that supports the craft of woodworking in Northern California by conducting educational programs and providing material and financial support to individuals and institutions in the field. Philadelphia locals may know May as the co-curator of the exhibition Making a Seat at the Table, Women Transform Woodworking, which is on view at the Center for Art in Wood this past year, good friends of ours. During that show's run, Mays was able to spend some time at the Esherick Museum, and we're so thrilled to have her with us today. That certainly wasn't her first encounter with Esherick, and so we're excited to hear not just her span of engagement with the artist, but also a little bit more about what she's been doing over the past 6 months when clearly nothing else has been happening. So without further ado, I want to say hello to Laura Mays.
Hello. Well, thank you everybody for showing up. I see some names that I know and some that I don't, so it's nice to have you all here. Thank you in your various time zones and your various bubbles for making your way here. So yeah, should I talk about when I first came across Esherick?
I was just going to ask you, I'd love to know how and when you first came across Esherick's work, and what was it about the work that initially interested you?
I think the first piece that I saw was the hammer handle chair, and it was 2005, and I remember it very distinctly. It was in SOFA, which is that show, Sculptural Objects, Functional Art in Chicago. And I was living in Ireland, working in Ireland, and the Crafts Council of Ireland had organised to bring over about 5 makers, I think, to the show. And I spent most of the time on the Crafts Council of Ireland booth, but then I, took a little wander around, and I saw this chair sitting on a podium, and I was like, interesting. I like the shapes of it. It was one of the only kind of old things there. And I went over to it, and the fact that it was made of some, I could tell that it wasn't, that there was something going on with the material, basically, the stuff it was made from, that it was, that these, that I was like, those are like handles of an implement or something. That it was just very intriguing. And I got talking, I don't know who was the person who was on that booth. I guess it was an Esherick booth. I don't know, or no, because I think that was the only Esherick piece there. But it was immediately extremely engaging on a number of levels. I could tell that the kind of triangulation made it a strong chair. It was kind of had the it was like a stick chair. Obviously, these things were sticks that were joined together. A fairly kind of vernacular, kind of simple way of making a chair. Simple, I mean that in the best possible way. And the fact that it was made from other objects was just very interesting.
So just to take a quick, I had a note from somebody that they were having a hard time hearing you. Can folks raise their hand if that is also true? Is that, are other folks having a hard time hearing?
Oh dear. Well, maybe I'll just shout louder.
No, it looks like most people are doing just fine. So
I'm going to get closer to my computer.
Okay, I'm sorry for that person who's having a little bit of trouble. I think that's such an interesting to really focus on this idea of creative reuse in the context of a piece like the hammer handle chair. What struck me when I read that in your initial writing for the Creatives on Esherick post was really how you were able to put this idea of creative reuse within the context of larger artistic movements. We often think of Esherick just as a solo lone practitioner, right? This idiosyncratic maker. But I'd love to hear how it really struck you in context.
I mean, I didn't know the story of the chairs at that point, but obviously later I found out that he'd made them as part payment for his daughters to go to attend kind of like drama lessons. And I guess what I quite liked is that he's not, as far as I can see, very kind of hard line in any of his choices that he made. Like, he was doing this in a very pragmatic way. They were cheap. He needed this thing. And I think that you can see his kind of, one of the things I like is you can see his brain kind of like churning all the time through all the stuff. He doesn't get stuck on anything. And he's kind of just making choices almost on the fly, like quickly and pragmatically, and not necessarily connecting himself to some, not like worrying about where he fits into any larger context. He's just keeping moving all the time. So yeah, I really appreciate his lack of kind of constraint, like it's just this kind of constant onward movement. The second piece I came across was actually in this magazine here, Woodwork magazine. And actually what struck me about the magazine was, I think it was the very first time that I had seen a woman on the cover of a magazine, and of a woodworking magazine. And I was drawn to it for that reason. But inside is a really great article about as well as a really good article about Susan Working, who's on the cover. Gordon Esherick's Corner Desk by Mark Sperry. And that was the second. So this was 2008 that I came across this.
And I'm going to pull up an image of that desk just so the folks can have that as a reference while we're chatting about it.
I also like the idea that people who are making stuff might actually be kind of misunderstanding context and movements. Like, I'm not sure that Esherick was particularly, intellectually involved with this idea of reuse, and he was more just doing it, just that, right. Sometimes misunderstanding or not being kind of overly concerned about one's place in the kind of overall history is important, especially as it turns out, he was like creating the context for studio furniture.
Absolutely.
It kind of didn't exist until he made it up. So obviously he couldn't be too worried about the kind of his place in history.
And I'm going to just bring up the hammer handle chair for reference there before you know, we're looking at a very different kind of piece of furniture when we look at the corner desk, right? It's stylistically different. It's different in terms of the materials and the approach. And so it's interesting to me that two really different expressions of Esherick's creativity provided these kinds of equal inspiration to you. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about this piece and why it resonated with you.
I mean, you know, I like triangles. It's a very simple, is what it comes to. But it's just so intriguing. It's just amazing. It's just an amazing thing. If you, the next slide there with it opened up and those incredible drawers, and the very top part is like that isn't a drawer. It's kind of like a cubby. You can lift those out and put stuff in. The next one down is a light that swings out. And so there's like a built-in light. I don't know, it's the kind of, the freedom and the inventiveness of it is just really amazing, just cool. He was not a perfectionist, even though this is beautifully made, but I mean, I think that's, you know, his collaboration with John Schmidt obviously allowed for this level of making. I don't think that Esherick himself was a perfectionist at all, and that, I think that's really great. You know, I think that the one could certainly getting hung up on perfection can be a big barrier, and I see him as someone who just didn't have that many barriers to making stuff, and that's really nice to see it all just kind of like flowing.
That there was just this, I have an idea, I'm going to make it, and I'll figure out how to find the resources, whether they are folks who can help me do it or or materials or that kind of feeling that resources are at my disposal even if I don't know what I need yet.
Yeah, and thinking about that, the hammer handles and wood in general, like in some ways wood is just a found material. We find it in trees, you know. So it's not a concept, it's not necessarily a huge leap from finding wood in trees or in the lumber yard and you search for the piece that you want, to seeing the handle and being like, that would make a good leg for my chair. So I think it's not a huge divide between those two things, just kind of working with what you've got, whether that's a tree, or whether it's something that somebody else has already worked on, a hammer handle.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that intrigued me about your picking one of Esherick's really major sort of cubist expressionist pieces as one of the pieces that resonated most deeply with you is that we think about cubism, we think about expressionism as this multiple, we're showing multiple moments at once in an object through geometry, through the sort of skewing of planes. Your own interest in thinking about subjectivity and subjective viewpoints in the work that you make, is there any sort of connection here in this kind of distorted reality of the desk that we're looking at, and some of your own pieces which take on those ideas of subjectivity?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I had to go and look up German Expressionism yesterday to make sure I was understanding it correctly. And then I watched The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And I think from what I could understand, it's much more about emotion, about the kind of subjective expression of emotion. And I'm not that interested in that particular aspect of subjectivity. Mine is more of quite about one's kind of perception and the representation of that perception. And it's not really the kind of emotional content or meaning of it particularly, more the physical, the fact that we are bounded by our physical bodies and therefore that's going to be our experience of the world. And I don't know what Esherick's connection with expressionism as a movement really was. I mean, I can see that his wood prints are very much in that style, you know, very, very much. And I don't want to sound disparaging, but you know, there's quite a lot of them that would be of a similar style by other people at that time. But when it comes to his furniture, that's where it seems like it's taken this kind of leap into his own mind. And I don't know how much he was trying to express like an emotional anything with this, and more just more of a spatial kind of relation with it, which is what I'm more interested in as well, the spatial and physical.
There's a shaping of your reality when you have a desk that looks like this, right? You are, you have to engage with this object in a certain kind of way, and it shapes how you exist in the world while you're using it.
Right. Well, that's one thing that's really nice about furniture is that it is so so intimate. It's so much part of our daily life and so we interact with it so kind of much, both on a conscious and an unconscious level, that it's going to kind of go, there's a back and forth relationship between you and that object. I mean, I guess now that just looking at this picture, you're not going to have like nice tidy thoughts on this desk. You're going to have like wild they're going to be more kind of there's a lot of stuff that's visible all at the one time, and you're going to have more, perhaps more, you know, jumbly thoughts.
It's interesting. I'm thinking of, you know, we're all working at home, and our desks are supposed to be these paragons of an organization in our in our messy lives, and maybe this is not a desk built for for that time. Absolutely. I'm curious, Laura, if we can talk a little bit about your time visiting the studio. I know, you know, we had the pleasure of having you here last fall for your time in Philadelphia related to the exhibition. But, you know, I'm curious about how seeing Esherick's work in context has made an impact on your understanding of him or your understanding of yourself as an artist. Are there spaces in the house that you find particularly meaningful?
Well, absolutely. Yeah. Well, one of the things I think that's really interesting is that one tends to see furniture, especially when it's kind of like a master, as these individual pieces that sit on white backgrounds. This one is sitting on like a white, it's not exactly a white background, but it's white wool and a white carpet. And I see them as these isolated pieces and consider them as you know, singular objects. And then to get to his house and understand that it's part of an entire, you know, an entire environment, that the singular object is just playing into the larger scenario, the whole thing, the complete work.
And I'll bring up, would you like an image of the downstairs or the bedroom?
Let's see, let's go to number 12 there.
Okay.
Yeah, wait, let's go to number 11. Yeah. Oh, the kitchen is just so lovely. So there are the hammer handled chairs, just sitting there like, you know, regular chairs, as you know, not exactly regular because it's not the most regular environment, but as part of a whole environment. And to see his house, it's almost like he built this thing like a kind of nest around him, that he was kind of forming this entire environment as part of the sort of inside of his mind become three-dimensional. And it's like a kind of it's also like I don't want to call it a playhouse, but because that sounds trivializing, but well, you know, Le Corbusier called a house a machine for living. And this is certainly not kind of mechanistic in any way, but it is totally suited to him, to his way of being. So it's like an expression of his interior made exterior. And it's just, you know, let's see, is it number 10 there? Is that the one where we can see? Yeah, so down to the right there and kind of over the back of that sofa is down into his workspace. So his work and his living and everything is completely kind of integrated. I don't know how much, I think some changes were made. Well, he seemed to be constantly changing it, which again is part of the point, is that it was constantly adapting to his needs, so that work and life were kind of absolutely seamlessly integrated, which I suppose, you know, we read so much about whether that's a healthy for one's you know, psyche, that one should have these boundaries and separations, but you know, obviously that wasn't happening. It was it's completely all the one thing.
It's all integrated. Yeah, there's
Yeah.
no boundary whatsoever.
One thing I find interesting about visiting the Esherick is, I think this was my third visit in last October.
Mm-hmm.
But what I had found interesting from the previous two was I actually had no interest in Esherick himself as a person, really, as is, I mean, the kind of details of his personal life, or
Mm-hmm.
even really his kind of like psychological makeup, as it were. Because I feel like you can understand him almost entirely by just being in this space. You don't have to understand the details of, I don't know, his divorce and things like that. But you
Mm-hmm.
can kind of, it's like getting to know somebody really well. You're inside someone's mind, kind of, when you're inside this space.
And maybe in a different way than he might present himself to you if it was just a person-to-person meeting, right? You're
Right.
seeing things that are maybe a little bit more intimate and hidden than might come out
In
in
fact,
a typical conversation.
yeah, the self-portrait of him, which is,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we have a picture of that. But it's a rather kind of, he looks rather kind of washed out and pale in his self-portrait that's hanging in this room. And,
Mm-hmm.
it's just not very, he's, not to be rude, but he doesn't look that interesting in that portrait, whereas absolutely fascinating when you're in his his brain inside the house.
I mean, I'd love for you to hear your thoughts on the bedroom, because I think that of all the spaces in the house, we might think about as really a self-portrait of a kind of space, especially because it has the books, it has the clothes, it has the stuff of daily life in a way that's really palpable.
Mm-hmm. Well, I love the way one approaches the bedroom by kind of, it's like you're twisting up into the top, into like the top of someone's head. And yeah, it was really interesting to see the books that he was reading, because he was pretty well read, it seems like. And then there's a storage for his all his shirts. Do you have that? Yeah,
Yeah.
that's so great. All his LL Bean shirts under his bed. Yeah, I just thought it was like a little escape nook, almost like a little eerie. I just thought it was very cool.
I mean, I think this may just be me. I think it's you too. We're all thinking a lot right now about home and how it functions and what we do in our homes and what home means as a result of. I'd imagine everyone here has spent more time in their home over the course of the last 6 months than they expected they would. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about how this time at home has impacted your work, or has it changed over the last 6 months? Has it brought things in your practice to the fore that I don't know, might relate to the way we think about the studio as a home in a new way?
Well, surprisingly, I actually haven't had that as much time to go to the workshop as I think I had before, which is totally like strange. Not quite sure how that works, but maybe anxiety uses up a lot of time. Homeschooling, I have an 8-year-old daughter. Homeschooling uses quite a lot of time. I can't say that my work particularly has changed. I can't say that, or my work style, although I feel like when I walk into my workshop, which is on my own, it's my own space, I do feel almost like this kind of like feeling of calmness kind of comes over me. And I don't like to think that craft is an escape from the world, that it's not connected to the world in so many ways, politically, all kinds of ways. But I do have to say that when I walk into my workshop and know that I'm going to have a certain number of hours to focus on one thing that's going to feel somewhat external to me, it feels really good. So I guess I'm speaking contradictorily there, saying that it does feel like an escape from this, but I also don't want to make craft seem like it's separate from the world, because it's intimately connected with all the problems and the good things about the world, in terms of like who gets access to wood shops, the politics of that, value, like how much people are, how much we value labor. I think everything like that is an intrinsic part of craft, but I also just get this kind of wash of calmness that comes over me.
I mean, I think I love that the dateline for your piece interrupted, and I'm gonna pull that up here. It reads, made during the pandemic spring of 2020, sometimes providing a welcome change of anxiety and focus. Can you talk a little bit more about this work?
Well, I mean, you know, anyone who is engaged in woodworking knows that, you know, anything can go wrong at any moment. And so one kind of, you know, trying to avoid things going wrong is part of it, or knowing how to escape, how to step out of a problem, to get yourself back to where you want to be is part of the deal. I had actually designed this or like conceived of it, made a mock-up of it prior to the pandemic. And I mean, it's a continuation of some of the other ones, of similar ones, in terms of it being a kind of like slightly just like a cube that's slightly as if it's drawn, but it's actually three-dimensional. It's kind of playing around with 2 and 3-dimensional representation, but then also including kind of solid and void, and trying to have things on different planes it gives you this, you know, parallax where, you know, where things are kind of shifting depending on where you're standing. So, which is very much one's subjective experience. That's where it connects with some of the stuff that Esherick was doing in terms of expressionism, you know. So, yeah. You know, there's plenty to think about and to worry about when you're making something, and I did find that a welcome relief to focus on how sharp your blade is, rather than you know, what's happening in the outside world,
rather than everything else.
Rather than everything else, yeah.
I mean, I'm curious if we can talk a little bit about questions of influence and legacy. I think anytime, you know, and we've been thinking about this as we've been doing this Creatives on Esherick series, anytime you think about influence from an artist from the past to a contemporary artist, you have to think about questions of what that artist's legacy is, how we shape it, how it positions the artist in relationship to history, and how somebody like you coming to Esherick and saying, well, this is what I see here, makes that legacy feel different or new. You know, so I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about this idea of legacy, how you see Esherick's legacy and your work in relationship to it, and also, you know, Esherick and Krenov have great similarities, and you're navigating your relationship to his legacy on a regular basis. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, it's kind of, I mean, as the director at the Krenov School, I am kind of dealing with Krenov. I sometimes feel like I'm in a relationship with him on an almost daily basis, trying to work out what is important and what's not important. Like, so it's you're trying to kind of, what is an incidental and what is a kind of truth, as it were, if such a thing could be said to exist. I think it's just a question of balance. I think it's just it's not that it's a job that's ever done, as it were. You're just going along, and with each situation, you're just trying to, like, well, how do we deal with this? How do we deal with the fact that, like, I've used this example before, but like, he didn't like biscuit joiners, you know? To me, that's like an incidental, because they just appeared at a point in his career where he was like, I don't need a new machine, or a new tool. I'm good with what I've got. So I don't really care about his attitude towards biscuit joiners. I suppose what that does bring up is like an attitude towards making in general, and trying to separate out what is like just what was kind of incidental to him, contingent, just because that's when he learned what he learned, and from what is like intrinsic to the making process that we should value and kind of take from that. So yeah, it's just a kind of ongoing balancing act is how I would describe it.
Well, and I think you're in a position because you're working with artists who are trying to figure themselves out, whether it's through technique or approach or style, within the context of this programmatic legacy. That you're in a sort of prime position to see how interpretation from each successive generation changes how an artist's legacy looks and how it's shaped and what it means to people.
I think that there's an interesting idea of misunderstanding. It's something I've just kind of been thinking about recently, is how people misunderstand the past, the current context, all kinds of things. And but that's not always a bad thing, especially, I mean, it's bad in like science, but it's not necessarily a bad thing in terms of making new stuff. That sometimes the misunderstanding can be as interesting as an understanding, and that people who make things are not historians. I'm not a historian, and I'm not an academic, and I'm not a theoretician. I'm kind of, and the people that I teach are makers, and that their misunderstanding or what they see can be every bit as, and what they interpret and take from it in a kind of, as it were, incorrect from an academic point of view way, can be every bit as interesting as if they had kind of like understood it correctly, as it were.
And certainly can give new life to as somebody who's a historian who works with contemporary artists quite a bit. Those misunderstandings, which I might not even characterize that way, right? It's an interpretation as much as it's a misunderstanding. It helps make the legacy of somebody like Krenov, of somebody like Esherick, relevant in ways that allow we want their spirit, their approach to be alive still. And that really happens not through a sort of slavish worship, but happens often through that kind of misunderstanding.
Yeah, it does. I think what it does, it keeps it kind of regenerating and keeps it alive.
I mean, I think you've done a lot of work to shape questions of legacy through projects like Making a Seat at the Table, which focuses on women woodworkers, right? You don't have, there are not legacies to manage or to take care of, right? If you're not doing the work to put those artists out there so that they have that kind of impact on subsequent generations. And so I'm curious how this question of legacy also plays into your curatorial practice. You've got this wide-ranging series of approaches.
Well, one thing that was interesting when we were kind of first looking at the project was wondering if women made different work than men. And we realized that could be a kind of almost like a dangerous road to go down, to think that it's kind of deterministic, to think that necessarily that women would make different work. But on the other hand, women, because of their kind of like long-term exclusion from the woodshop, do have less of a connection to the history of woodworking. I mean, because they weren't making work for the most part for literally thousands of years, making woodworking. So the relationship to the past can be more free, basically. Perhaps, or there's an opportunity that they can do more of that kind of creative interpretation and kind of like pulling what they want, rather than feeling any burden of history that, in a very literal sense, my dad did it that way, so I'm going to do it this way, or that's the way my grandfather taught me, so therefore that's the way it's done. And so there is an opportunity, I suppose, for a more free approach from people who have not been traditionally making work. And I think it's hard to say exactly, to point at any given piece and say this was made by a woman and she does not feel the burden of the past, but as a kind of generalized sense of opportunity for change, I think that women have brought that into the field, and hopefully that it won't just be women, it will be other people who haven't been given access to woodworking. to the
Yeah,
project.
the past and questions of legacy aren't a burden, and instead it becomes you know, a library of inspiration to
Yeah,
choose
a
from
playground.
and to play
Yeah.
with. Exactly, exactly. So this has gone very quickly. So I want to I want to open it up to questions and make sure that we have some time
Right.
for folks to you know, ask anything they want of Laura on Esherick, on her own practice. If you'd like to put a question in the chat, I think that's probably the easiest way to do that. So we've got a question from Joe here. Esherick's desk is the kind of work I aspire to, but while I see the design freedom that it expresses, it's also got some of the most complex geometries I've ever seen in wood. Because of that complexity, I can't see the piece as at all spontaneous. It strikes me as a very planned object in contrast to some of his other work. Can you address that tension?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. It's true that it's remarkably complex. Some of those, you know, the pieces of wood they're in that are not like in plane with anything else, and and it's a dovetail drawer, and you're like, that's insanely complicated. And I think that possibly it's because of John Schmidt, and allowed his technical skills allowed Esherick to kind of like Esherick could be the spontaneous one and John Schmidt had to make the thing. And I think the relationship between the two is probably something that would be really interesting to explore further, to see exactly how that dynamic worked. But in general, like, I suppose woodworking is fairly, you have to be a certain type of person in some ways. I think you have to be quite a person who goes like, first I do X, and then, you know, you have to be a pretty stage-based, you know, take stuff in steps, because, you know, you can't make the piece of wood longer once you cut it shorter, or there are a few little tricks. But for the most part, it's like a fairly controlled process. And I think that woodworkers, to a large extent, or often, kind of are looking for some way to be spontaneous. You see people looking for that kind of gesture in woodworking, and it's quite hard to achieve. Like ceramics is going to have more of the kind of just like the pure hand on material kind of sense, whereas woodworking is always seems to have, especially when it's a piece that's, you know, not just a single object, like when it's a complex piece like that has joinery and everything, it's going to be planned out, so it's never going to have that pure spontaneity that some other objects can have. And I do see woodworkers sometimes kind of champing at the bit and wishing they could do something a little more kind of just gestural. I can't think of a single example now of something that where something like that. I'm just thinking off the top of my head of the work of Joseph Walsh, who's an Irish maker who makes these, you know, like super swirly, very kind of, they look like a wave in the air, very gestural, but they are incredibly planned out in advance. He does it all on Rhino, and, you know, it's absolutely worked out. So it's, I think there's always going to be that tension in woodworking, in this kind of woodworking.
And I see folks here have said Kimberly Winkle possibly as an example, or
Right.
spoons, just spoons, exclamation
Yeah,
point.
it's a single object like that. Yeah. Also, her finish is, well, I think of her as just like a master or whatever, mistress finisher. Like, her finishing is amazing. Color.
And then we've got, I think inlay can have some elements of freedom, especially when using conical sawing.
I don't know conical sawing at all. But yes, but it still has to be planned to some extent, as far as I'm aware. Inlay is not something I know very much about. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? I mean, I'm thinking back to that, your note about that relationship with John Schmidt, and I think you call it a fortunate collaboration in your own writing. And so how seeing the physical space in which those collaborations took place, what does it mean to think about that kind of historical conversation within a space rather than just the space as a sort of aesthetic context? To have that little bit, you know, I know coming in, you weren't so interested in the history of Esherick, the man, but that relationship with somebody like John Schmidt means something, and the fact that it happened within these spaces can mean something too.
Right. Well, I mean, when I visited the house, the house and studio the first 2 times, I was like, where did he actually do any work? There were no machines or anything there. And I was very confused as to how it actually happened in that space. I know now that, well, he built the, and Louis Kahn designed the building, and that's in fact where the work happened. But I think what first interested me was that we're quite hung up, especially I think in the Anglophone world, of the idea of the singular maker, and that the maker's hand is really important, and that is a kind of adds a layer of authenticity to the whole project, and that here it was quite evident that it wasn't necessarily Esherick's hand on everything, and that doesn't diminish, by no means diminishing his work.
And I'm going to actually share my screen because I know this was a moment that really struck you in the house and might be a sort of nice moment to end on. The coat hooks here that show Esherick and his collaborators.
Yeah.
I'm curious how these struck you when you first saw them.
I was just so taken by them because they're so sweet. I mean, it was a time of, you know, when I saw it, I was like, oh, he really cared about the people he was with, and putting them into this into his house, having them there all the time. They're like, you know, medieval gargoyles or something, like having these humanized objects around you all the time. I was just so struck by how sweet it was. It was a sweet and also the kind of stylized. If you go back to that other one, you see how the one of John Schmidt, I think, is the one on the left there, and how stylized it is, and how you know, it's almost abstracted version of the face.
It is. I will say though, one of the things that we've we love pointing out to people is that you can see the teeth of the saw blade.
Yes.
So the face may be abstracted, but we've got the tool rendered.
Well, that's kind of like his non-obsession with kind of perfection, or a certain type of perfection. You know, they're perfect in their way, obviously, but not always bringing everything to a super high finish.
Yeah, absolutely. Really nice.
I saw a question in the comments from Jess. Did Esherick build mock-ups? That's not a question I can answer.
Yes, and we have more information about that on the website, and we can certainly share more about that with you. We have a good number of mock-ups as a part of the museum's collection.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I was going to speculate that he didn't, because another thing is he's remarkably prolific. I mean, the amount of stuff he did was quite there are a couple of mock-ups, a couple of theater sets.
There's theater sets, there's cabinets. What we can do, if people are interested in that, is include a couple of images of mock-ups in the follow-up email that we'll send after the chat today. And you can certainly always reach out to the folks at the studio to ask more about that. We're at the end of our time. Oh, I hear one more question.
Are you taking questions on the phone as well?
Sure. Well, we're close to the end of time, so you'll be our last question of the day.
Okay. So, you know, what strikes me is the amazing breadth and the pantheon of his work that goes beyond woodworking to, you know, he was actually quite a remarkable painter, woodblock prints, sculptor. What role do you think that played in, you know, his life in woodworking? And is it something that you do as well?
I mean, the prints that I'm seeing that you guys are posting on social media of that he's doing are just so lovely. But for me anyway, I don't feel they're as expressive and they're sweet, but they're a little bit generic or something. They don't feel as, it's like he hadn't found his way of being quite yet. But obviously they must have taught him, you know, the use of wood, just being around wood, grain, cutting it, sharpness, all the kind of technical skills that are needed to make a woodcut would be very transferable. I have to say, yeah, to me, they're like someone who hasn't made it yet, who hasn't found their own way of being, of what they want to do with themselves quite yet. They're a little bit like other people. Not that I think that originality is like such a, you know, necessarily a thing to be sought at all costs by any means, because it's kind of like it's just silly. Like it's not going to happen. There's always going to be precedent, as we've been talking about, but the kind of energy that's behind his furniture work is just so kind of remarkable, I think. The other second part.
Take 2 more minutes. We've got 2 more questions.
Okay.
Okay.
Well,
We'll be a little generous.
I try to do drawing and stuff like that, but I don't have as much time as I have. So woodworking is really my main thing that I do, other than all the life stuff.
Thank you.
And so then maybe we'll end on this question from David here. Is the act of woodworking as important as the outcome to you?
Well, and then he's put i.e. craft versus design, which
Yeah.
I don't think those necessarily. Actually, the act of woodworking is more important than the outcome, I think, for me personally. I'm pretty motivated towards the outcome, but that's kind of part of the process, if you know what I mean. When I get to the end, I'm usually really excited at the beginning of a project, and by the end, I'm kind of like, okay, now what's next? Kind of ready for the next thing. But I don't think that's the same as that being more interested in design than craft, and that is such that's a big, like, thinking about craft versus design and making versus planning, and it gets into this whole can of worms to do with your head versus hand kind of dichotomy and things like that, which we don't have time to do.
That's a whole additional conversation. So.
I'm sorry. I know David from Ireland, so that's really nice. Thank you for that question.
Well, I want to thank Laura. Thank you so much for spending this time and giving us your thoughts and your conversation. The voices that we're hearing through the Creatives on Esherick series really do help keep Esherick's legacy alive and shed light on it in new ways. And so I'd encourage folks to check out the other entries in the series that are on our social media and our website. And I hope that everyone will follow Laura as she's doing more amazing work. And we hope to see you back at another virtual event for the Esherick Museum, or in person when we're open again to the public. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Laura.
Thank you. Thank you.
It was a pleasure. And thank you all for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.